Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. We're really excited to present our paper, AI's Regimes of Representation, which is a community centered study of South Asian representations in text to image models. This is joint work done by myself, Rida Qadri, my collaborators, Cynthia Bennett, Renee Shelby, and Emily Denton. Our work is motivated by how generative AI is currently being widely touted as an opportunity to democratize creative practice. And as you can see, models now can generate really high quality images. However, evaluating an image is complex, and it's not just a question of technical quality or aesthetic quality. As Stuart Hall reminds us, an image has both a denotation, so the thing that is being shown, and a connotation, so the message that the image carries. And evaluating the connotation requires deep cultural expertise. So, for example, in this case, Islamic art historians might note that this image has Orientalist connotations, where the art style mimics colonial representations of mystical Eastern worlds, an example of which you can see on the left. As a Pakistani Muslim, I'd note that these images recirculate a lot of Western media tropes that reduce diverse Islamic worlds into homogeneous religious iconography. But since there's nothing overtly offensive or toxic about these images, a researcher who is not attuned to these sensibilities may not even know to test for them in their evaluations. But what these images demonstrate is the need for that kind of evaluation for culturally competent metrics of representation. And that is why we are studying what we call AI's regimes of representation, borrowing Stuart Hall's phrase. What we mean by this is the algorithmic scaling up of existing ways of representing cultures and populations that have historically underpinned Western hegemony and imperialism and racist discourses. So, this work responds to calls from the fact community in three ways. First, the calls to reorient our frameworks outside the Western world. Second, to center impacted communities in our research, and three, to integrate interdisciplinary perspectives in our work. And we both respond to these calls and extend existing fact scholarship by running a culturally situated empirical study that distills model failures experienced by South Asian communities, which in turn advances our knowledge of cultural limitations of text to image models in a non Western context. We're also showcasing a community centered methodology that allows us to connect model limitations to broader experiences of sociocultural marginalization. And we are also extending the epistemology of model evaluations by leveraging a framework built from critical cultural media and post-colonial studies that then allows us to situate these emerging generative technologies within prior histories of knowledge production, representation, and marginalization. Okay, so how did we do this? We hosted a series of focus groups with participants from three South Asian contexts, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. And we co-investigated harms and limitations of four state-of-the-art text-to-image models. In the first focus group, we fostered a general discussion about participants' existing experiences with media representation. Then, in the following survey, we asked participants to suggest culturally specific prompts that they wanted us to probe the models with. And then we had a final focus group where participants collectively reflected upon the generated images. And so this approach enabled us to develop culturally specific limitations of text to image models, which we call failure modes, and also create a taxonomy of harm, which connected the failure modes to existing regimes of representation that communities were experiencing, and also get at broader tensions of inclusion in AI. So we distilled the participant discussions of text-to-image model limitations into three failure modes: failure to recognize, amplifying cultural defaults, and perpetuating cultural tropes. We'll focus on the last two, but you can read about all three of these in the paper. Okay, so let's dig into how text-to-image models amplify cultural defaults. So, participants noted that text to image models appeared to default to Eurocentric cultural artifacts, even when the prompts did not specify any cultural context. For example, when prompted for a photo of a house of worship, models showed Christian American looking churches. But participants also went beyond these by now expected patterns of technology centering whiteness to name a much more complex hierarchy of cultural defaults that reflected their own regional power centers and intranational axes of discrimination. For example, participants from India and from Pakistan and Bangladesh discussed how prompts that referenced South Asia defaulted to Indian representation, something they felt erased their identities. Similarly, when prompts explicitly mentioned India, for example, in this case, a photo of Indian food, participants noted that images were defaulting to what they identified as upper caste North Indian cultural subject matter. And these hierarchies actually became extremely important when thinking about an evaluator's positionality. In this case, North Indian participants did not pick up on these representational biases, thinking that this was a good representation, whereas South Indian participants did call out this lack of diversity that they saw. The third failure mode we'll discuss is imagery perpetuating cultural tropes. So, participants named 4 tropes that they felt constantly emerged in text to image models. One, South Asia as impoverished. Second, South Asia as exotic. Third, Muslim lives as one dimensional. And fourth, Dalit communities as disempowered. And these were all tropes that participants noted reflected stereotypes that they had experienced within traditional media. So, let's take one example. The trope of South Asia as impoverished and underdeveloped came about a lot when participants prompted models for depictions of daily life in various cities in South Asia. So on the slide, you can see an example of generated images for the prompt people spending their day in Peshawar, a city in Pakistan. And you can see how these images are showing markers of poverty while erasing any signs of the city's cultural history. And so, as one participant said, what I wanted was something that presents our culture, and what I received was a dusty street with a few rickshaws.
But to truly grasp the impacts of generative AI, it's not enough to just talk about model limitations, but we have to link these limitations and failure modes to sociocultural marginalizations that communities experience. In our study, participants discussed how these failure modes harmed them by validating an outsider's gaze of their cultures. One participant reflected that what is fed into AI models is a Western version of the East, which is aligned with the long history of media representations pandering to the touristic Western gaze. Participants also described the distress of seeing their cultures erased in models outputs, saying AI represents the majoritarian view. And if you're someone who doesn't fit in that, then it's particularly disturbing for you. Our participants also articulated tension that underlie the development of culturally inclusive models. Some participants were optimistic about the potential for generative AI reflecting their cultures in nuanced and complex ways. For example, as a possible platform to call attention to certain kinds of folk art practices. On the other hand, some participants noted their discomfort with data sets including folk art that was rooted in and connected to marginalized populations, artisanal traditions, and political struggles. As one participant reflected, perhaps it's good that AI can't capture folk art styles. Some participants suggested just opting out, noting the impossibility of disentangling new technology from histories of exclusion. But ultimately, many participants landed on community agency as the most important point of intervention, rather than diversifying representation, exemplified by this call to imagine a more authentic world communities can build themselves. So what are the big takeaways for future work? First, we want to think about the possibility of culturally inclusive models. As one participant mentioned, there's an overwhelming diversity of visual vocabularies in the world that current generative models are missing. But we also have to consider what responsible inclusion looks like. As one participant emphasized, our processes of inclusion must truly respect communities and not just be tokenistic representation. Second, in our analyses of generative AI impacts, we have to recognize that generative AI is a technology of cultural production. And as with technologies like the camera and TV, their representations are deeply entangled with existing structural and cultural inequalities. So we can learn more about the possible impacts, including the benefits and the harms of emerging AI technologies by turning to prior scholarship on power, technology, and representations. While community-centered research in AI is important, we also have to make sure that our methods are sensitive to intra-community power dynamics. For example, in our study, participants were all South Asian, but their individual social locations, such as nationality, caste, class, and ethnicity, all changed how they interpreted images and the impacts that they named. So this was just a quick summary of our work, which we hope is one step amongst many towards creating spaces of agency for communities to tell their own stories within and through AI. Thanks so much for listening, and please get in touch with us for any feedback you may have.